Welcome back. We're looking at the rise of the Muslim middle class and how this will affect relations between countries in the Middle East and the West. Now, joining me here in Washington, D.C. to discuss these issues is Vali Nasser, a professor of international politics at Tufts University. Dr. Nasser has just written a new book, Forces of Fortune, The Rise of the New Muslim Middle Class and What It Will Mean for Our World. He's also a senior advisor to the U.S. Special Envoy to Afghanistan and Pakistan, Richard Holbrooke. Just before the break, we had Lee in South Africa talking about 9/11 and the image of Muslims since. And for a lot of people looking from outside, it seems that America is always looking for an excuse to brand Muslims in a negative way. So in looking at how the Muslim world can change in its interaction with the West, let's look at how the West might change in its approach to Islam in general and Muslims in general. Currently, Iran is seen as a huge threat. When you look at Iran and how it fits in with your idea that the economics can change, first of all, there's the issue of what will happen in Iran, but there's also how America might change its view towards something like Iran. What's your proposal for something like that?
Well, the way I approach this book is to say that the kinds of issues that capture news or capture imagination in the West, such as extremism, jihad, nuclear weapons, is not the only story in the Muslim world. That there are other things happening in the Muslim world. There's been an economic and industrial revolution in parts of the Muslim world. That you have the rise of new economic powers in the Muslim world. And some of those will matter in the long run far more than the ones we think. So when we look at countries like Iran, like Pakistan, like Saudi Arabia, we ought to not only think in terms of the issues of hard power and nuclear issue or extremism or religious fervor, but we ought to look at what is happening economically in those countries. You know, we should look at their economic potential. We should look at what is the main change agent in those societies. So I think, you know, even in Iran or Pakistan, if we're looking for what force is going to change those societies, it's going to be the middle class. It's going to come from the economy. And again, if you went to a country like Dubai and you looked at the Pakistanis and Iranians doing business in Dubai or doing shopping in Dubai, you get a vision of what is the real change agent in the region. I always say, and I mentioned in the book, that often in the West we're constantly looking for a religious reformer. We think that the change agent in the Muslim world is some person who's going to change the religion, whereas the real change agent in the Muslim world is going to be a businessman.
Well, let's get a call in from Omar, who's on the line from Washington. Omar, thanks for your patience. What would you like to ask?
Yes, I was calling to ask about the thesis that economic freedom leads to political freedom. You know, the Gulf states have actually had very high economic freedom. In fact, Bahrain, according to the Heritage Foundation, has great economic freedom, number 17th in the world, and actually has greater economic freedom than Israel. And these countries have also had good growth in the past few years. But what we don't see is these political freedoms coming in any way in the region at all, and not even in terms of democracy or human rights, but just simple constitutionalism, rule of law issues. And we also see large immigrant populations from India, Bangladesh, other countries doing a lot of the hard labor and low-level jobs in these countries. I don't see a middle class, you know, coming up pressing for political freedoms in these countries. I was just wondering what you thought about that.
Okay. A very good question. The first answer is that we cannot time this relationship. In other words, we know that after a certain threshold, and it's happened historically, that economic freedom, and it's not just economic freedom, but economic wealth leads to political freedom. We saw it in South Korea, we saw it in Taiwan, but we haven't seen it in Singapore. We don't know exactly what the threshold is, but history tells us that economic freedom does push political freedom. The second issue is that the small countries of the Gulf are not a good example because small countries, just as we see with Singapore also, provide for a very different dynamic for social political control. And the third argument is that it is not enough to just have economic freedom and just have wealth. You have to have a middle class. And that's the real difference. A middle class that is not dependent on the government handing it down oil money or entitlements. But you need a middle class that the government depends on that middle class. And when you have that, then the government will end up having to listen to that middle class, would have to change the laws for wealth generation, and then you begin to have a certain degree of political opening.
We had from one of our viewers in live station where the community is chatting online as we go out live, Shahzad from the Netherlands wrote in saying, do you think Islamic values and the politico-economic structures of the West can coexist?
Yes, I don't think they're incompatible. We're seeing them coexist in Turkey right now. You have the most Islamic government that you've had in Turkey, in a country that was built on the back of secularism, that imported a lot of political institutions from the West. And you have a government whose leadership are very religious, who believe in Islamic values, and they have found that they could rule over a modern capitalist democracy while also being true to both Turkish values and Islamic values.
Oliver's on the line from Virginia here in the US. Oliver, what would you like to ask?
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.
My question for the author is, how come then the 19th hijacker during the September 11 tragic events, all of them came from middle-class families? I mean, they didn't have problems with money. I mean, they were very privileged people. So how do you justify that?
That's a very good question, and I get asked that often. Let me say that, first of all, terrorists are always middle class. If you looked at terrorists in Latin America, if you looked at groups like the Baader-Meinhof gang in Germany, if you looked at groups like the Red Army Brigade, even if you looked at those who went to terrorism in the 1960s in America, the Weathermen, etc., they all came from middle class. And that has to do with the sort of the disruption that the middle class has between the very elite and the very poor. The issue is not whether the terrorists are middle class. The issue is whether the middle class as a whole supports terrorism or not. And middle classes that are connected to market economies, just like the German middle class never supported the Baader-Meinhof gang. The Italian middle class didn't support the Red Army Brigade. That is what you want to have in the Muslim world. The second issue is that the hijackers did come from middle class, but the middle class in the countries that they came from were middle classes that have become wealthy on the back of oil money that is handed down from the government. The middle class in those societies are not the capitalist middle class of Turkey, Argentina, South Korea. They're not wealth-generating middle classes. They're wealth-consuming middle classes. And that's not the right relationship we're talking about.
Let's squeeze in a quick call from Shaukat in the UK. Shaukat, go ahead.
Oh, hello there. Yes. I'd like to ask, I'm a Bangladeshi British citizen. And when I go to Bangladesh, I see there are people, a few people who are very wealthy, and vast majority of people who are absolutely poor. And there is lack of middle classes. And I agree with your guest, we need middle classes in Muslim countries. Do you think the best way we can create middle classes in Muslim countries is to have inward businesses which will create more middle classes like in India and in China? Thank you.
About 30 seconds for you to answer.
So it requires regulatory reform. You have to change the way the economy is organized to allow more people to invest in it, make money. The money then produces people, the middle class. You cannot create middle class out of thin air. You have to create the economic conditions that allows the middle class to grow.
Well, there's obviously lots more questions I'd like to ask you, Dr. Nasser, but as always, we run out of time. I thank you so much for your views, and good luck with the book as well.
And thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for joining us with your questions too. Now, remember, you can follow our program on Twitter. We'll keep you notified on upcoming shows, and you can send us questions and comments to pose to our guests. On the next show, the case of Major Nidal Malik Hassan, who's accused of killing 13 people in a military base in Texas, and has sparked a raging debate across America. Was he motivated by his faith, or was he wrestling with psychological problems? And how will the shootings impact Muslims in America? Hope you'll send in some questions for that. Don't forget, you can find out more about that on the Facebook page as well. But from me and the team for now, we'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Da